The sound of shattering glass tore through the gleaming corporate tower at the exact moment the first wave of panic broke loose. One instant the building had been humming with its ordinary Tuesday rhythm, phones ringing, elevators chiming, the low murmur of 100 quiet conversations, and the next, everything cracked open into chaos. Somewhere above, a transformer had failed, and the failure had become an explosion, and the explosion had become smoke, curling in slow gray ribbons through the vents of the atrium as if it had all the time in the world. The alarms did not wait politely. They screamed, relentless and metallic, bouncing off marble and glass until the sound itself felt like a physical thing pressing against people's chests. Employees abandoned their desks without a second thought. Laptops worth more than some of their monthly salaries were left open and blinking, forgotten mid-sentence in unfinished emails. Heels clattered against stone. A man's briefcase burst open on the stairs, spilling papers that no one stopped to gather. Fear, it turned out, moved faster than fire ever could. On the wide marble staircase that spiraled down toward the lobby, a woman in an elegant black dress collapsed, both hands clutching at her injured leg. She had been trying to help someone else, a young assistant who had frozen in terror, and in the scramble, her ankle had given out beneath her, sending her down hard onto the unforgiving stone. Around her, the crowd surged past like a river that had no patience for a stone in its path. She tried to call out, but her voice came out thin, barely a whisper, carrying the exhausted weight of someone who has already begun to accept the worst. A man stopped. He knelt beside her instantly, ignoring the bodies rushing past on either side of him, ignoring the smoke thickening overhead. She looked into his face, a face she did not recognize, a face that belonged to no one she had ever noticed before, and, through the fog of pain, she found enough breath to beg him to leave her. "Go," she managed. "I can't walk. Don't waste time on me." He did not answer with words. He answered by staying. His name was Matteo Salinas. He was 39 years old, a night shift maintenance technician employed by a small contracting company that handled electrical repairs and industrial upkeep for half a dozen office buildings across the city. Every sunrise marked the end of another exhausting shift for him, the 8th hour of crouching in crawl spaces, rewiring breaker panels, replacing ballasts in flickering fluorescent lights that no executive would ever think to thank him for fixing. And every sunrise also marked the beginning of his real job, rushing home before his 8-year-old son, Tomas, woke up, so that there would be pancakes on the table and a familiar face at the kitchen counter instead of an empty chair. Life had not been gentle with Matteo. 5 years earlier, he had watched his wife succumb to an illness that no amount of love or overtime pay could outrun. In the aftermath, he had quietly folded up whatever dreams he once carried for himself and tucked them away in some drawer he rarely opened anymore. What mattered now was smaller and larger at the same time, that Tomas never went to bed feeling forgotten. Every peso mattered. Every hour mattered. He worked nights so he could be present during the day, sacrificing sleep in a trade he never once complained about. And yet, somehow, none of it had hardened him. Somewhere beneath the fatigue that had settled permanently into his shoulders, Matteo held on to a stubborn, almost old-fashioned belief, that even if life had forgotten how to be kind to him, he would not return the favor by being unkind to anyone else. That morning, he had been 3 floors up, kneeling in front of an open electrical panel in the Cumber Azul Corporate Center, one of the city's most prestigious addresses, when the mechanical explosion rattled the walls around him. He was on his feet and moving before he even fully understood what had happened. Alarms bloomed through every hallway. People burst out of conference rooms mid-sentence. Security guards shouted directions that no one seemed to be listening to. And through it all, the smoke kept spreading, patient and indifferent, sliding through the ventilation system like it had nowhere else to be. It was in the middle of that chaos, on the wide central staircase, that Matteo noticed the woman lying still while the world rushed past her. He didn't know, not yet, that she was Renata Valdivieso, the celebrated chief executive of Valdivieso Technologies, one of the fastest-growing companies in the country. He didn't know that business magazines described her in the same 3 words over and over, relentless, exacting, nearly impossible to impress. He didn't know that thousands of people admired her from a distance, quoted her interviews, studied her leadership principles in business school case studies, while almost none of them had ever seen the quieter, more solitary woman who lived behind the headlines. To Matteo, in that moment, she was simply a person in pain, and that was more than enough reason to stop. She had twisted her ankle badly trying to steady a junior assistant who had panicked at the first alarm, and the fall had wrenched something deeper in her leg. She tried, twice, to push herself upright, and twice the pain dropped her back down onto the cold marble. Matteo reached her just as another wave of frightened employees came pouring down the stairs, forced to step around her like water flowing around a rock. Renata's face carried both agony and something quieter and sadder, resignation. She was already convinced that she would only slow him down, that his best option, his only sensible option, was to leave her where she lay and save himself. "Please," she said, blinking back tears she refused to let fall in front of a stranger. "Just go. I'll be fine." He didn't go. Instead, he calmly shrugged off his heavy work jacket, the one stitched with the logo of a maintenance company no one in that glittering building had ever bothered to learn the name of, and folded it beneath her shoulders to shield her from the freezing stone floor. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask what she could offer him in return, because the question never once crossed his mind. He simply lifted her, carefully, settling her weight across his back, and began to descend the smoke-filled emergency stairwell, one careful step at a time. She protested weakly, tears finally slipping free despite her best efforts to hold them back, insisting he was making a mistake, that he didn't understand who she was or wasn't, that this wasn't his responsibility. Matteo only tightened his grip and kept walking. Each step grew heavier than the one before it. The smoke thickened with every floor, curling into his lungs, stinging his eyes until the world blurred at the edges. The emergency lights flickered erratically, throwing the stairwell into brief, disorienting darkness before flaring back to life. Dozens of employees rushed past them on either side, some glancing over with a flicker of concern quickly swallowed by their own fear, most not glancing over at all. Renata could feel how labored his breathing had become beneath her, how his steps had begun to falter, how his knees trembled with the effort of carrying a stranger's full weight down flight after flight of stairs while breathing air that grew thinner and dirtier with every landing. And still, he never once suggested setting her down. He never once suggested that this was too much, that someone else should take over, that he had done enough. Every few flights, he paused only as long as necessary to steady his breath before continuing, sweat soaking through his shirt, his arms burning, his legs shaking with exhaustion he refused to acknowledge out loud. He did not know, in that moment, that the building's hidden security cameras were recording every second of it. The stumble on the 9th floor landing, the moment he nearly lost his footing near the 4th, the way he kept murmuring quiet reassurances to a woman he had never met before that morning and had no reason to believe he would ever see again. By the time the firefighters finally reached them, Matteo was staggering, half blind from smoke and fatigue, as he pushed through the main entrance and out into the cool morning air. The instant his feet hit the pavement outside, whatever reserve of strength had carried him down 30 flights of stairs simply evaporated. He lowered Renata gently onto a waiting stretcher, made sure she was settled, and only then allowed his own legs to give out beneath him, collapsing onto the pavement beside her. Paramedics rushed toward them both. News crews already stationed outside the burning building swung their cameras toward the scene, catching the tail end of something that felt, even from a distance, larger than an ordinary rescue. Reporters murmured to each other, assuming at first that the man who had carried the CEO to safety must be part of her personal security detail. When someone finally clarified that he was, in fact, an overnight maintenance technician who had simply happened to be in the building, a ripple of disbelief passed through the gathered crowd. Renata spent the following days in the hospital, recovering from torn ligaments and a collection of smaller injuries that ached more with each passing hour than the doctors had initially predicted. Matteo, for his part, returned to his usual shift the very next night, saying nothing about what had happened, mentioning it to no one, not even bothering to correct the co-workers who had somehow heard a garbled, second-hand version of the story and dismissed it as exaggeration. For him, helping another person had never required an audience, or reward, or even acknowledgement. It simply required being present when it mattered. A week later, without warning, Matteo was summoned to his supervisor's office. He assumed it was about a scheduling conflict, or perhaps a complaint about overtime hours. Instead, he found a polished black sedan waiting for him outside, its driver holding the door open with the kind of practiced patience that suggested this was not his first time waiting on someone who had no idea what was happening to them. Thoroughly confused, and more than a little wary, Matteo climbed in. The car carried him, in near total silence, across the city to the headquarters of Valdivieso Technologies. His mind raced through every worst-case scenario on the drive over. He wondered, with a tightening in his chest, whether someone intended to blame him for the accident, whether some detail of the rescue had been twisted into a liability the company wanted to pin on him. Instead, he was led into an executive boardroom where dozens of the company's senior leadership stood waiting, all of them on their feet the moment he walked through the door. At the far end of the room stood Renata, recovered enough now to stand upright with the help of a slim cane, her weight still favoring her uninjured leg. When Matteo entered, the room did not simply glance at him. Every person in it rose, and the sound of chairs shifting back filled the silence like an ovation that hadn't yet found its voice. Renata crossed the room slowly and thanked him, there, in front of everyone. She explained, in a voice steadier than the one he remembered from the stairwell, that in all her years building a company worth billions, she had learned exactly how easily success could disguise selfishness. How a title on a door could quietly convince a person that other people existed to serve their convenience rather than the other way around. Hundreds of people had walked or run past her on that staircase, she said. Some had recognized her face immediately. Others had seen her on television a dozen times without ever knowing her name. And still, almost no one had stopped. Only a stranger, someone with no reason to expect anything in return, had chosen compassion over fear. She told him she had watched the security footage more times than she cared to admit. She had watched him kneel beside her again and again, had watched him risk his own safety, over and over, for someone he believed could never repay him. For the first time and longer than she wanted to acknowledge, she said, she had been forced to remember what real leadership actually looked like, and it hadn't looked anything like a boardroom. Then she made her announcement. Valdivieso Technologies, she said, would be establishing a new employee assistance foundation, one dedicated to supporting single parents and low-income workers navigating hardship. The foundation would carry Matteo's name, not because he had ever asked for recognition, not because he wanted it, but because she wanted every employee who walked past that name on a wall or a letterhead to be reminded, every single day, that character outweighs any title a company could hand someone. Matteo stood there, momentarily unable to find words. He had never imagined that one decision made on instinct, in the middle of smoke and panic, could ripple outward into something like this. But Renata's biggest surprise hadn't arrived yet. She handed him a plain envelope, her hand steadier than her voice. Inside was a proposal unlike anything he had ever imagined for himself. It wasn't money. It wasn't charity dressed up to look like an opportunity. It was a full-time position, one built specifically around him, Director of Community Engagement and Employee Well-being for the entire company. She explained, gently but firmly, that technical skills could always be taught. Integrity could not. She wanted someone on her leadership team who genuinely understood what it meant to struggle, someone who could help her build a workplace rooted in compassion instead of fear, in people instead of spreadsheets. At first, Matteo hesitated. He had spent years quietly believing that men like him belonged in the background, in the crawl spaces and utility closets, while people with different educations and different last names made the decisions that mattered. Renata, watching the doubt cross his face, told him, without a trace of condescension, that true leaders are defined by what's in their chest, not what's printed on their resume. That night, He sat down with Tomas at their small kitchen table and talked it through, the way he talked through every important decision, because his son's opinion had always mattered more to him than any executive's. By the time Tomas fell asleep, Matteo had made up his mind. He accepted. The transition was not easy, and no one pretended otherwise. Several members of the board quietly questioned whether a maintenance technician truly belonged in executive meetings. Others doubted his capabilities without ever saying so directly, letting their silence and their sideways glances speak for them. More than a few people, in private conversations they assumed he'd never hear about, predicted he would fail within the year. Instead, Matteo did something none of them expected. He listened far more than he spoke. He visited the overnight shift workers whose schedules mirrored the one he had just left behind. He got to know the cleaning staff, the cafeteria workers, the security guards, the receptionists, the interns who ate lunch alone because no one had ever thought to introduce them to anyone. He remembered names, all of them, every single one, without needing to write them down. He asked about people's families, their kids, their late nights, the things that kept them up worrying long after their shifts had ended. He found practical, unglamorous solutions to problems that executives with far more resources had somehow managed to overlook for years. Slowly, almost invisibly at first, the atmosphere of the company began to shift. Turnover, which had quietly plagued the lower ranks of the company for years, began to drop. Productivity improved, not because anyone demanded it, but because people, many of them for the first time in their working lives, finally felt seen. Months later, Valdivieso Technologies received national recognition as one of the country's most employee-focused companies. Journalists praised Renata's leadership in glowing profiles and industry panels. And every time, she smiled the same quiet smile, because she alone knew where the real lesson had come from. Not from a boardroom strategy session, but from a man who had once worn dust-covered work boots into a building where everyone else wore polished leather shoes, and who had never once thought that difference made him less capable of leading. One quiet Saturday morning, Matteo and Tomas visited a small community park, newly built and funded entirely by the foundation that bore Matteo's name. Children's laughter carried across the open field. Parents who had spent years carrying burdens no one else could see finally had a place to sit, breathe, and watch their kids run free for an hour without worrying about the next bill or the next shift. Renata joined them there too, quietly, without cameras, without reporters, without an entourage, just a woman leaning slightly on a cane, watching a little boy chase a soccer ball across the grass. Watching Tomas run, unburdened and laughing, reminded her of something she said she never wanted to forget again, that success was never measured by the size of an office or the value of a stock portfolio. It was measured by the lives quietly changed by small, unremarkable acts of courage, acts that rarely made headlines, that rarely came with applause, that happened in stairwells and hallways where no one thought to look. Sometimes, she had come to understand, the strongest people in any room are not the ones with wealth or influence or a corner office. Sometimes they are ordinary parents, carrying invisible weight every single day, who somehow still find the strength to carry someone else's weight too, without ever being asked and without ever expecting to be thanked. That unforgettable morning, inside a burning building, had begun with a woman who believed she had already been left behind. It ended, months later, with an entire company discovering that its best leaders are often the very people no one had ever thought to notice. The world tends to celebrate power, money, and success loudly and often. But the truest stories are usually written quietly, by ordinary people who choose compassion in the exact moment when everyone else chooses comfort instead. Matteo never expected recognition. He simply refused to leave behind someone who needed him. And because of that single decision, made in less than a heartbeat on a smoke-filled staircase, a whisper of fear slowly became the beginning of countless new hopes, proof that even in the darkest moments, one brave heart is sometimes enough to light the way for everyone else.